Okay, now without further ado, we're going to invite back up Dr. Burgess. He's going to share with us the forces of division in today's America. And even if you get a little depressed, Dr. Kaufman will lift you back up again, so no worries.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear there's so much optimism in the room, but you haven't heard my second lecture yet. So, Carrie, I got the after lunch opportunity here. I think I drew the short straw, maybe. So, all right. Yeah, I need more cute animals. I definitely need more cute animals in my presentation.
You know, the picture of Mark smiling was a great one. Love that one.
All right. This afternoon I'm going to talk about what we're calling the woke revolution. That was a term that they embraced, but maybe are running away from now. But some of them would call it the social justice revolution. But it's the current state of affairs that we find ourselves in, right? And I'm going to point out, and I'm hoping tonight when you go to bed you see this slide in your dreams, that there are absolutely the similarities between what we're experiencing now and what happened in France and Russia and others, but, you know, I don't have the whole semester to teach it, right? But anyway, here's once again challenge or deny religion and religious truth, offer a secular version, remove the moral conflict from an internal struggle to an external one, right? Good and evil depends on which side of the battle you're on. Introduce a vision for a future utopia, and develop and promote the ideology, and then well, get rid of those who stand in the way. All right, so the French Revolution, as we saw, offered a rationalist vision, and liberty, equality, fraternity was their highest ideals of Enlightenment thought. The Russian Revolution offered a materialist vision. The Bolsheviks called for peace, land, and bread. That was their slogan. And it represented the material well-being that they promised from the revolution. The highest, these were the highest ideals of materialist thought, right? So the woke revolution promises diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So what's the philosophical basis for this vision? Well, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the race and gender theorists, primarily in America, but in the West, replaced the class-based critique of Marxism as the new cutting edge of radicalism. They replaced Marxism with a new philosophical basis, postmodernism. We're all, by these days, pretty well versed in Marxism, but this one most people really don't know if you weren't in the academic institutions. Okay, so this is kind of a joke. By the way, the slides I'm presenting are not my slides. I pulled them from people trying to teach about these things, right? But this is a little bit of a wag, right, who's saying truth. All truth is relative except this statement, right? So that's a little bit of the conundrum of postmodernism. All right, let me explain what it is. First of all, it's post-atheistic. What do I mean by that? It rejects not only God, but truth itself. The rejection of truth is based on one of the pillars of postmodernism, deconstruction. And maybe you've heard this term, maybe you're unfamiliar with it, but deconstruction questions the very idea that there are like fixed meanings. Meaning is always deferred in their language, right? And really what it means is it's always relative. It's really a pure form of relativism, and that's the one thing I want you to take away from this talk about the postmodern philosophy. So without a stable sense of meaning, of course, there can be no truth. So this is a picture of Jacques Derrida. He's the author of Deconstruction. And basically, according to our formula, as I say, it's post-atheistic. What does that mean? There's not only no God, there are no universal truths, meaning there's no religious truth, no philosophical truth, and this includes rationality in science itself. I'll get into that in a little bit. And that's why there's actually a bit of some disagreements on the left between those who are still clinging to the more Marxist view of things and the postmodernists. But that's why I say postmodernism isn't militantly atheist like Marxism is. It's like, right? It's indifferent to the question of God. It's indifferent to truth. In fact, Derrida, what he argues is that behind the search for truth is really a search for God, right? So without God, there can be no truth. So what does that mean? What is truth then? They argue that it's what they call, and again, you may have heard some of these terms, I don't know, but this is a common term. It's a meta-narrative. What does that mean? Right? That means it's a story we tell ourselves about meaning, or about the completion of some unrealized purpose, right? About the meaning or goal of life, or of history especially. And it rejects this notion as an outmoded concept. That's what they consider modernism to be, but they're postmodern, right? So if truth is a story, it's just a story we tell, then where does it originate? Well, what we understand as truths are just an expression or extension of power. That's the theory of Michel Foucault, the lovely gentleman here, who argues that knowledge is produced by the powerful, and it serves the purpose. Excuse me. It serves the purpose of maintaining their privilege and power. So Foucault refers to this, he uses the term power knowledge, right? Knowledge is always an expression of power. Here you see how he writes the term, right? There's no power without knowledge, there's no knowledge without power, right? So they're two sides of the same coin. What this approach does is it delegitimizes the Enlightenment and every other form of knowledge or truth, right? So we're going to see the implications of this soon. But I just want to point out, this is a graph, again, by one professor. So the older system before capitalism was feudalism, and the form of power is domination, and the struggle is usually ethnic or religious. It's a generalization, but a good one. In capitalism, of course, Marxism defines it as exploitation, and then the form of struggle is class struggle, and that's what the theory says, right? According to this postmodern view, the historical formation, he calls it modern, but it really should say postmodern, the form of power is subjection. And Foucault writes all these books about how asylums and prisons and hospitals and all these institutions were formed, right? And how they were formed for the state to control people, right? So the form of struggle, and again, this is going to come up again and again, is identity struggle, right? And also resistance. Okay, we'll talk more about that in just a minute. Okay. So I want you to notice there's a big difference here between the two theories of power between Foucault and Marx, right? For Marx, power is a negative thing which we can get rid of by the revolution, right? For Foucault, power is everywhere. It's in every relationship, right? But it's also creative, right? But it also always engenders some form of resistance. Where there is power, the last point, there is resistance. Resistance is never outside of power, right? So it's a different understanding of struggle, right? So in this sense, Foucault shares a relativist view with Derrida. He rejects the notion that history has any goal or purpose, right? And that also includes an explicit rejection of Marxism. I mean, you know, Marx, history had a goal, right? It had an end point. Right? But for Foucault, there's no end point. There's no goal. History is just a series of events. You know, they may not be entirely random, but they're not leading any particular direction, right? And everything is relative, right? All opinions, beliefs, religions, and moralities are equally good. And I would add to this, or equally bad, right? All beliefs, truth statements, worldviews, and theories are equally true. Or I would add equally false, right? That's Foucault's idea. So, as I said, power is in every relationship. There's no getting rid of it. And even in, you know, in your family, right? In your local community, in your church, I mean, everywhere. It's all about power. So, so it's not concentrated in two classes in the way it was in Marx. Right? And in fact, I would describe it as more of a grid. Okay, here's one professor's attempt to try to map out power in Foucault. Please take notes. There'll be a quiz later. Right? As you can see, it's everywhere. It's complex, right? It's dispersed throughout society, but not evenly divided. Some have more than others, right? Some have less. It can't be tamed or eliminated, as Marx had hoped. The only way to fight power of the privileged is either to resist it or to fight it with a counterpower. In any given relationship, there's a power imbalance, right? Which means that oppressor and oppressed, unlike Marx, it was confined to the working class and the capitalists, right? But in Foucault, it's everywhere, right? It exists in every relationship. So in the woke ideology, the original sin of oppression is multiplied and extended to other groups as well. And we'll see, in particular, it's picked up by race and gender theorists. Okay. So, what does this mean? What is human nature? Okay, this is the philosophy. This is good and evil. But please understand, it's all relative, right? Of course, right? But relatively speaking, what we've been describing is good and evil in postmodernism, right? And then, what about human nature, right? What is human nature like? In postmodernism, human nature functions, it's part of the function of social conditions. Marx thought it was a function of class culture, right? That is, the mode of production determined what humans were going to be like. But postmodernism sees human nature as constructed by all social interactions. And they use this term. This is a very popular idea that's spread throughout the humanities and social sciences, that things are socially constructed, right? So that means that, there aren't any preconceived ideas, and we are basically what society tells us we are. Right? So, again, this is just an example of one instructor's attempt to try to map this out. For postmodernists, social construction means your identity is determined by your place in the power grid that I just described earlier. It is endlessly fluid depending on the forces acting on you. So there's nothing fixed. You're always constantly being reshaped and remade. It's what they mean when they say our identities are socially constructed. There's no stable or fixed you. You may have the mistaken impression that you have an identity, but you are really nothing more than what society tells you you are. All right? So, to say that race, for example, is socially constructed means that my identity is based on what? It's a social construct based on how people define themselves and others, on physical and social characteristics, right? It's because of the social meaning people have attached to it. It has less to do with my skin pigment and more to do with the place assigned to me within the power grid. Right? That's, again, this is the postmodern philosophy. So what does that mean? It means you can be president of the United States and still be oppressed. Right? I mean, this is the implication, right? And also, you know, the same applies to gender. It's used in gender ideology. Society imposes on me the definition of what it means to be a boy or girl, man or woman, and expects me to conform to it, right? So you can be a collegiate champion swimmer and still be oppressed, right? I call this the founding myth of postmodernism and the woke ideology. There's no truth. Everything is relative. All identity is socially constructed. It's mythic in the sense that it's the unquestioned first principle behind postmodernism. You're not allowed to question these assumptions. According to them, these are self-evident, right? These are axiomatic. I would strenuously disagree, but that is the philosophy, right? So these ideas are just merely asserted. They're the founding principles, but they are not yet an ideology by themselves, right? This is the point at which the philosophy, you know, this is the philosophical basis of it, but in order for there to be some revolutionary activity, there needs to be an ideology, and then finally a political agenda, right? So in terms of ideology, as with the French and revolutionaries and the Bolsheviks, it takes an ideology and a political program. And so beginning in the 1990s and the early 2000s, postmodern philosophy was adopted by the race and gender theorists. Before this, they had largely been Marxist in their critique of Western society, right? But, and in fact, the idea like critical race theory, it comes from something that was known as critical legal theory, and it was started by a Marxist legal scholar named Derek Bell. This is one of his students, Kimberly Crenshaw. We're going to meet her again in just a minute, but she's a key figure in the transition of critical race theory into a postmodern ideology. This is Judith Butler, who I studied with. And gender theorists, like critical race theorists, replaced the old class-based critiques of Marxism and adopted postmodern philosophy as the basis for their new revolutionary ideology. She was and is a key figure in gender theory and queer theory, and her book, Gender Trouble, was an early seminal work in this. So, as I mentioned before, postmodernism rejected truth. It included the Enlightenment idea of objective truth and science. There's a bit of a struggle. On the one hand, they're telling us about science, right? On the other hand, the postmodernists deny science, right? And we're going to see how that works in a minute. It's just another form of oppression. It's power knowledge, right? So the institutions that have power are the ones that make up the ideas, and they impose them on you. That's the theory, right? So, and they argue, the race and gender theorists argue, that objective truth in Enlightenment culture was oppressive to who? To what they define as marginalized groups. Right? We'll explain that. In the absence of objective truth, it is my experience that is the ground of woke ideology. The truth of their experience, of course, is that they feel oppressed, right? So that's because they say they experience oppression. And you can't tell people what their experience is, right? Right. So it's clever. So truth is then replaced with what? My truth, right? You've heard that, right? My truth, right? And so I feel oppressed, therefore I am. This is the cover of a recent book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. But it's a woke subjectivism, right? The new truth. I feel, therefore I am. Right? There's more to it, but I'll share a little bit. We're going to look at the elements, then, of the woke ideology. First is standpoint theory, right? This came originally from a few people, but Nancy Hartsock, who I also studied with, she was actually a Marxist in the beginning. But her ideas became adopted and transformed by the, postmoderns. Standpoint theory means that knowledge is based on your experience. It's based on what you feel, right? It's not based on some objective truth doesn't exist, right? So what's the basis of knowledge? It's your experience, which is where you are in the social grid, right? What does that mean? Actually, it's very important here. You've heard white supremacy, right? People talk about white supremacy. Some of us resemble that remark, right? This is a frequently used example. What does it mean? It means, Carl, if you're white, Carl, I can tell, right? You're not aware of your white supremacy. You can't be because you don't experience it. It's people who are not who experience your white supremacy, right? And frankly, there's no truth, there's no objective truth, there's no knowledge, there's no standard. So there's nothing, you can't argue against that, right? If you insist on objective knowledge, it's just another example of your white supremacy, right? These white supremacists, one of the characteristics is objectivity. They believe in objective truth, right? So, and they're defensive too, because if you call them on it, they might say, wait a minute, no, right? But that just means you're more of a white supremacist, right? When I was young, we used to call this stereotyping, right? And it was a bad thing back then. But now, and if you're white, you're too fragile to even have a conversation about your white supremacy, right? And let me explain what a conversation is. Right? It's not what you think. It's not like a discussion or debate with opposing views, right? That would be an example of white defensiveness, right? By conversation, it means we're going to tell you about your white supremacy, and if you resist it, well, it demonstrates your white supremacy. Right? So the beauty of standpoint theory is it allows you to attack the very identity of others based on my experience, which you can't deny, right? So it's been used to create a culture of accusation, right? Now, the second point of woke ideology is what I call mapping oppression. I hope this is big enough that you can see it. Here you have a line of domination, right? And then you have, at the top, for example, an able-bodied person is oppressive to a person with disabilities, right? You see the line that goes through, right? Or a fertile person is oppressive to a person who's infertile, right? Now the whole Gentile, non-Jew versus Jew, I think that has to be removed these days, right? But because I don't know if we can allow Jews to be oppressed these days, right? The way things are going. But anyway, this is part of the sort of Foucauldian power grid, right? Oppression exists in every relationship. And frankly, you don't have to do anything just because you have European heritage. It means you're oppressive to non-European origin people, right? That's the theory. I'm not making this up, right? This is a map that was drawn by again, a woke ideologist by the name of Catherine Polly Morgan. She's not with us anymore, but and how do you know you're oppressed? Well, you feel oppressed, right? Now, this is the theory of of Kimberly Crenshaw. You remember what I had a picture of her. And it's intersectionality. How many of you have heard of intersectionality before? Most of you have definitely heard of this, right? And she says it's a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it locks and intersects. It is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and privilege. That's a quote. So again, the map I just previously showed you was a little too linear. This maps out sort of a grid, again in the Foucauldian manner, a grid of oppression, right? So you can be oppressed on any number of these at the same time, right? So intersectionality, what it literally means is that it's an intersection of oppressions, right? So it takes that linear concept and makes it three-dimensional. All right, well, what does that mean? Actually, before I get into it, this is what one WAG has come up with. It calls it the Oppression Olympics, right? If you're the most oppressed person, then you win the prize, right? So, actually, Kimberly doesn't like that, but as I've been told. But I will point out, actually, I'm going to talk about identity. This basically the linchpin of the woke ideology is identity politics. But there is still this ongoing struggle between the Marxists who are hanging on, hoping for the revolution to take down capitalism, and that's going to solve all our problems, and the other sort of woke ideologist who says, oh yeah, right, my revolution always has to wait for yours. Right? So what is identity politics? It actually began in the 70s, had Marxist roots, as everything did back then, but it has morphed into the postmodern world, right? Postmoderns argued that equality of opportunity, which had been the previous goal, right, of civil rights and the sexual liberation movements and all the Marxist-inspired movements of the past, they only serve to support the dominant groups and their oppression, right? So postmodernism has infiltrated all of these different study areas, which are now departments on university campuses, right? And they have all become sort of proponents of the postmodern theory. So again, let me remind you, identity is socially constructed. It means that who I am is determined not by me, but by the social forces around me. But the woke ideologists argue we should embrace that identity and not resist it. For the purposes of political struggle, they consider it a source of empowerment. Right? My identity is my position in the social grid. It's the place from which I can resist, which is the term they're big on. It's who I am. So if I'm a gay Chicano, for example, my experience of that, of being that gay Chicano, is who I am. That sense of oppression is the source of my identity. But it's the basis of my resistance to the injustice of the system. It is the source of my power to fight systematic injustice. And we're going to see that's the notion that the injustice is systematic, it plays a huge role. So identity politics argues that they adopted the view, so the identity politics people now have adopted the view that political struggle now meant that society must affirm their marginalized and excluded identity. That's what has to be affirmed. You have to affirm that I, in my position, am marginalized and excluded. So when they say inclusion in DEI, right, diversity, inclusion, and equity, inclusion doesn't mean what you might think, you know. Like, I have an Indian son-in-law. I have a Korean daughter-in-law, right? We're pretty inclusive, right? But that's not what they mean. It means that I'm marginalized and you did it. Yeah, you did it. So accepting me in my marginalized state means accepting that you've done this to me. You are guilty of oppressing me. And it's really the new definition of good and evil to fit the oppression narrative. And it also, oppression is systematic. You're familiar with the 1619 Project. It argues that the point of America was slavery, right? It's built into the system. You can't, you can't extricate it from the system. So in a liberal worldview, society can be reformed. In a Marxist worldview, it could be rebuilt after a revolutionary transformation. But in the postmodern worldview, society is created on the basis of discrimination. Created on the basis of discrimination. It's built into the system. It is the system. So what do? You have to get rid of the system in order to get rid of the oppression, right? But this is the thing. They're not quite utopian, because even if you do, there's no utopian outcome. It's just more endless struggle, right, against oppression, because it's in every relationship, because they've adopted the Foucauldian model. You often hear that CRT is just teaching the history of racism in America. And are you, John, against the teaching of racism in America? How could you be against that, right? You can't. Well, what's being taught isn't history, it's ideology, right? The ideology of identity politics is that if you're a minority, the system is rigged against you. You cannot succeed. The goal has to be the destruction of this kind of evil system, right? Racism is entrenched in the fabric of society. If it's in the fabric, what do? Right? So, and again, this is another, this is the director of education and community engagement at a college, right? Reality is that racism has been woven into the social fabric, right? This is what's, being repeated. So the idea of social justice then means what? It means it requires equity. Equity really sounds very positive and fair, right? But when the ideology says that you're oppressed, you cannot succeed and the system is rigged against you, what does equity really mean? Well, again, this is another slide that a professor uses to show the difference between the Marxist approach and the new postmodern approach, right? So, and I want to put for your attention, so again, it's based on material, we've discussed that, and it's rooted in modernism, and the goal is equality, right? In the postmodern system, the goal is what? It's difference, right? That's pretty important, actually. That's a fundamental shift. It means, you might think inclusion means everybody's at the table, right? That's not what it means. It means you have to accept that you have oppressed me, and my position is to exert that difference, right? It's antagonistic at its core. So, like critical race theory, gender theory has been used to be based on Marxist principles, but it's transitioned to postmodern approaches. While equality used to be the goal, it's now difference, right? So if you wonder why transgenderism suddenly become such a hot-button issue, it's because it represents the ultimate attack on identity. And on biology, frankly, on science, and it's the furthest links you can go, currently anyway, to attempt to create your own identity, right? We used to say, stick it to the man, right? The ideologists see it as the tip of the spear in the fight against what they consider to be gender oppression. Right? So, of course, it's based on this notion that it's fluid, right? Gender is fluid. All right. Who here works in the schools? Anybody? Have you guys seen this? If you're in the schools, you've seen it. If you're not, you need to know. This is what they're teaching your sons and daughters. Right? The genderbread person. The genderbread person, right? And so gender is now a sliding scale. People are encouraged to identify as gender fluid as part of creating your own identity, right? So anyway, you need to take it in, right?
By the way, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but in learning this as a teacher, it makes your head spin.
Yeah.
You go through 3 or 4 pages, you identify as, and you act as,
Yeah.
and it goes like 3 or 4 different directions at once, and you have to respect each one of the things. It's
That's
really
right.
just nutty.
No, that's right. So,
Oh dear.
the ideology always goes to the most extreme point, doesn't it? Right? And currently that's transgenderism. But the thing is, my self-identification has real world consequences, right? And it absolutely impacts others. And I won't show pictures, but this is what we mean by gender-affirming care, right? These are mutilations, let's be honest. Mutilations of the human body in order to create my own unique identity. And it's a mutilation of the body, but more fundamentally, it's a mutilation of the human self, right? So it's the gender identity, the theory is the clearest attack on science and objective truth, right? It asserts, as postmodernism does with everything, that gender is socially constructed. What does that mean? Well, biology then is essentialist, right? I love that word, essentialist. It means that you might think biology is scientifically true, right? But what they're saying is, no, what I decide, it's my experience, right? Your biology doesn't trump my experience. Right? And furthermore, the philosophical basis of it is that science is a product of the oppression of the Enlightenment. Right? So it should not stand in the way of me expressing my own lived experience. Right? I'm trying to throw as many buzzwords in here as I can, but you guys have all heard them, or if you haven't, you will. Now, queer theory is maybe even the cutting edge of gender theory. It is, at its core, deconstructive. It's meant to be subversive. It's offered as subversive, to break down all boundaries, all distinctions. Even those that were previously untouchable theories, such as the biological innateness of homosexuality. Remember, for years, that was the argument. Gays can't change because it's biologically wired, right? It's innate. But queer theorists say no. It's all a choice. It's all a performance. It's all a part of me expressing my identity, right? So there's, these are points of contention even within the theory here. So queer theory is anything but mainstream. In fact, it's an attack on everything mainstream, right? And by the way, from their definition, you don't have to be queer, meaning gay or whatever, to support queer theory, right? And vice versa. Many gay people do not endorse this. So queer theory may be the pinnacle of woke ideology. It rejects all meaning, all truth. What is a woman? Undefinable. What is race? There's no fixed categories. Right? It's an attack on the core of human identity. Actually, even the Pope came out with a statement last month, right? Calling it a grave threat to human dignity. So these are the elements of the woke ideology. What about the agenda? Well, the stated agenda, right, is diversity, equity, and inclusion. I've already discussed what inclusion means, right? It doesn't mean that we all come together in some sort of big salad bowl, right? But it means that, you know, you've marginalized me and now you have to accept me in that marginalized state. And diversity means including as many of these different identities as possible, right? But what is equity all about? That's the one that really, you know, we hear the most about, right? It's quite literally about redistributing power. This is an example, again, if you're in the schools, you must have seen this, but even if you haven't, this is how it's often portrayed, right? So the tall guy didn't need the box, and the little guy needed two. So it's only a matter of fairness. We take from people who have and give it to people who don't have. What could be more fair, right? And of course, this implies the boxes are just there. They're just lying around. But this, you know, son of a buck over here is hoarding, you know, his box and not giving it to the one who really needs it. Right? I'd simply like to point out, we've tried this before, right? The revolutionary government in France seized the assets of the church in the name of fairness, right? Where did that end? The Bolsheviks seized the land and the wealth of the Russian nobility, and the class enemies were all eliminated in the name of social justice, right? Where did that end? So, again, the agenda, the woke agenda, it's, you know, you've heard in Marxism they talk about the long march through the institutions. Well, the same thing is happening with postmodern approaches. So it began, of course, in higher education, academic institutions. Actually, Frank and I were both in school back, you know, 30 years ago, and you know, they're always looking for a new methodology, right? And especially after Marxism. So yeah, this made an absolute march through the departments, I can tell you that. In fact, I shared once with Frank, you know, in 91, the Soviet Union collapsed. In 1991, if you walk through the bookstore at my university, every sociology, political science, humanities, literature, education course, they all had, you know, books on Marxism. In 1992, they were all gone. Right? They disappeared. Right? But in their place were these new postmodern philosophers. Right? So DEI has made this march from, it first started in the academy, and then it filtered down through the education departments into the K through 12. And of course, in corporate America, it's embedded in the HR departments. Right? If you work in business, you've encountered this, right? So it's also the S in ESG, right? It's the social aspect of the ESG agenda, right? And finally, it's embedded in a lot of government programs as well. Right? So it's everywhere at this point, right? So currently, the woke agenda operates on the basis of cancel culture, right? And you can see, now again, this is from a critic of cancel culture, the difference that they believe is in liberal culture versus cancel culture. But let me talk about cancel culture, right? Because what it does is it allows woke ideologists to attack the enemies of their revolution, but in the contemporary democratic culture, right? They don't have the political tools for a literal reign of terror, right? So instead, they're chopping off the heads of the cat in the hat and poor Mr. Ed, right? And we're going to need a bigger basket, right? So again, cancel culture is attacking and canceling things that don't fit with their narrative or their agenda. For now, this is what their reign of terror looks like. For now. And of course, here's one of the faces of systematic oppression. Right? Now, she doesn't really believe that men should take the place of women, right? And so for that, she must be canceled. And look, you can agree with her or disagree with her. That's really not the point, because the point is that no disagreement with the woke agenda is permitted, right? And for her sense, they have tried to cancel her. Fortunately for her, she has more money than God at this point, so they're not having much luck, right? Not all of us are in that position, right? But the point is, cancel culture doesn't simply mean boycotting. Boycotting is a strategy that you use to try to influence change, right? It's not boycotting. It's denying her voice, delegitimizing any point of view which doesn't embrace the woke ideology. When debate, discussion, and dialogue are considered tools of oppression, it leads to dehumanizing people, turning them into enemies, right? And we've seen that movie before, right? The rationalists and the materialists tried to remake countries based on reason and Marxism. Those who did not accept the new utopia were first dehumanized and then eliminated. The results were catastrophic, dystopian nightmares, of course. So cancel culture is the first step in dehumanizing opponents of the current secularist revolution. In the name of progress, it is an attack on the very core of American values and American success. And I would simply point out, it was 70 years between the publication of the Communist Manifesto and the Bolshevik Revolution, right? 1848 was the publication of the Communist Manifesto. This quote from Mr. Zinoviev that I shared earlier is from 1918. So there was 70 years of dehumanization of the bourgeoisie, of the capitalists, that laid the groundwork for their elimination, right, and for this kind of attitude. So I leave you with this. Actually, I too have great faith in the genius of the American people and the American experiment. Liberals and conservatives have both made great contributions to making a more perfect union. But what the woke ideology is offering, the dismantling of a system of oppression, offers nothing more than division and strife, not a more perfect union. It will lead no place good. All right, thank you for your attention.